Today we'll be looking at these two movements together, because there really is a lot of overlap between feminist art and postmodern art. Feminist art could be said to actually fall under the umbrella of postmodern art. Many feminist artists were also postmodern artists, but feminist art specifically focused on themes of women's rights and oppression. Postmodern art in general signals a shift towards portraying the subjective experiences of different minority and marginalized groups in the United States. Here are some important terms and artists to look out for in this lecture that you can use in your Unit 8 reflections. Feminist art, which is a general term applied to art being made at this time with feminist themes, was largely a result of the women's liberation movement of the 1970s, also referred to as second-wave feminism. Conceptual art was a large part of the activism of the movement, and thus art was and remains an important part of the feminist movement. In addition, art from this time period, both specifically feminist art and postmodern art in general, is incredibly referential, meaning it is constantly referencing other works of art, other famous artists from the past, and mixing and matching old and new styles while making statements about the past. Because of this, art becomes increasingly more inaccessible and difficult to interpret for those outside of the field. It requires a more robust knowledge of art history to understand. We also see the beginning of issues of appropriation. How much can you or must you alter an image to make it your own, rather than a copy of someone else's work? Postmodernism and feminist postmodern art challenged the ideas presented by modernism, specifically that art was universal, that it was based on truths of human experience that everyone could relate to, and instead focused on the subjective experience of the artist and the viewer. They often did this by exploring themes of identity and culture, how art was made and experienced differently by different groups and types of people, and celebrating that difference. And finally, postmodernism emerges at the beginning of the Internet age, in a parallel to modernism, which emerged at the beginning of the Industrial Age. Just as with modernism, we see an ambivalence towards technological advancement, though with postmodern artists, it was regarded more positively. An extension of the major civil rights movement of the 60s, the women's liberation movement of the early 1970s called for greater recognition of women artists, both from the past and in the present. Art historical research revealed that although women had regularly contributed to the development of Western art, they were rarely mentioned in its written history. So feminist artists often highlighted and referenced the work of past women artists and their legacies. This is part of the message in Judy Chicago's famous installation, Dinner Party. Each place setting at the triangular table is for a famous woman artist, writer, scholar, or activist, and is inspired visually by them. On each of the plates, a sculpted or painted vagina is rendered. Some are more stylized and abstract, and some are quite naturalistic. Some artists at this time, like Chicago, were influenced by what are called essentialist ideas of feminism that defined female experience in terms of the biological differences between women and men. They created imagery based on female anatomy, explored taboo topics around menstruation and reproduction, and used their own bodies in performance. Part of the reason for doing this was to draw attention to the double standard of how taboo it was to discuss female sexuality or sexual organs, but women could be openly sexualized all the time in advertisements and on TV. So in this quintessential feminist piece, Chicago is both paying homage to powerful and successful women that came before her, but is also boldly displaying feminine sexuality in an uncompromising way that comes across as celebratory. Miriam Schapiro, another important artist for the feminist movement, chose to take traditional crafts and media from what was considered the women's sphere, such as sewing or quilting, and incorporating them into high art. Shapiro added fabric and quilting into her artwork, such as Personal Appearance No. 3, shown here, which celebrates traditional women's crafts with a formal and emotional richness that was meant to counter the male-dominated minimalist aesthetic of the 1960s. Shapiro coined the term femage, a combination of female and collage, to describe the particular decorative style that celebrated crafts and traditional folk art and earned its own place in the pattern and decoration movement in New York. Other feminist artists chose to hone in on the lack of recognition for female artists throughout art history and the inequality that continued and continues to exist in museums. The Guerrilla Girls are a group of anonymous, feminist activists from the art world, artists, art historians, and museum employees that aim to call out the sexism, racism, and bigotry that exists within the art world. They first organized guerrilla art projects, such as pasting posters around cities in the middle of the night, which contain statistics about the lack of diversity in museums. The women wear gorilla masks, as a pun on their name, and to hide their identities, and assume the name of famous female artists. As their projects gained fame, Guerrilla Girl prints and posters started to make their way onto billboards and into special exhibitions. The Guerrilla Girls have always stood against not only bigotry and inequality, but the profiteering of museums and corporations, and thus have been historically excluded from many museums. Their work is bright and flashy like an advertisement, and usually incorporates witty humor to capture the viewer's attention and get the message across. One of their most famous works is The Advantages of Being a Woman Artist, a tongue-in-cheek list with points like knowing your career might pick up after you're 80, and being included in revised versions of art history. The Guerrilla Girls continue their activism today, now on a global scale, and have expanded their initial vision to include other causes that all revolve around equality and rejection of art institutions profiting off of suffering and inequality, calling themselves the conscience of the art world. Postmodern artist Barbara Kruger also used posters and advertising-inspired aesthetic in her artwork. Most of her work deals with provocative topics like feminism, consumerism, and individual autonomy and desire, frequently appropriating images from mainstream magazines and using her bold phrases to frame them in a new context. Some works were more explicitly political and feminist, like this poster she created for a march on Washington to support legal abortion, and others are more vaguely dealing with identity. Her works concerning consumerism and capitalism tend to be witty and sarcastic, like, "I shop, therefore I am," a reference to the 17th century French philosopher Descartes, who said, "I think, therefore I am." Kruger's work has always taken a critical approach to the commodification of art, which she achieves through using the visual language of advertising itself. Some audiences, however, have missed the critical point of her work. One particularly famous brand even blatantly stole her style and imagery without credit to make a brand logo. Such a profiteering motive is ironically totally at odds with her distaste for commodification of art and the rabid materialism of the United States. Another feminist and postmodern artist who really honed in on themes of identity in her work is Cindy Sherman. She's a photographer whose work consists entirely of portraits of herself, dressed in different costumes and playing different roles. Her work is largely associated with feminism because it offered a perspective of a female model where the subject was not a passive object of sexual desire created by and for men, but rather one where the woman was both subject and photographer, and was any person that she wanted to be. Sherman's chameleon-like portraits deal with the complexity of different identities and the performative nature of public identity, placing her squarely within the postmodern movement. Some of her photographs depict recognizable types of normal people, like an aging rich socialite, a young blonde actress, or a group of rich suburban partygoers, while others depict clowns, famous historical figures, or subjects from paintings. While Sherman's aptitude for photography is notable, her costuming and acting skills, her ability to totally transform into a new person, are praiseworthy. Themes of identity in postmodern work are most evident in the art of marginalized and minority communities. African American artists, building on artistic trends first established in the Harlem Renaissance, continue to express their identities and longing for their cultural roots in art that defied Western aesthetics. In stereo styles, artist Lorna Simpson pairs 10 pictures of hairstyles on a black model with 10 descriptive words and phrases, leaving it up to the viewer to match them, and thus confront stereotypes that they associate with certain hairstyles worn in black hair. Faith Ringgold, echoing the craft style, celebrating folk art practiced by Shapiro, encloses a family portrait from her childhood around printed and quilted cloth. Ringgold called her work story quilts, which draws on the African American tradition of quilt making and of weaving in narratives of African tradition, since it was forbidden for slaves to talk about or practice religious or cultural traditions when first brought to America. Ringgold has made the illustration through the eyes of a child, visually describing the city as a magical place, as she imagines herself flying through the sky. Ringgold eventually used the image for a children's book. Arguably one of the most important postmodernists of the 20th century, artist Betty Saar pushed norms of acceptability and made viewers uncomfortable as she boldly confronted racism, stereotyping, and the fetishization of Black people, particularly Black women, in America. This is an assemblage piece. Remember we looked at assemblage and combine art 2 lectures ago with artists like Robert Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns. It combines multiple iterations, both sculpture and prints, of the character Aunt Jemima, who was a racist caricature of a Black woman based on minstrel or blackface performances from the 19th century. Emerging in the late 1800s, America's mammy figures were grotesquely stereotyped and commercialized images of Black women used to sell kitchen products and objects that served their owners. Saar sought to reclaim this racist imagery and empower the subjects of it. She has replaced the giant pencil the sculpture was holding with a shotgun, and put a grenade in the other hand. In front of the portrait of the woman holding a white baby, which is a reference to the common practice of white women with slaves to force their female slaves to be wet nurses for their children, she has painted a Black Power fist. Saar forces viewers to reckon with the racist imagery that is a huge part of their history, and reclaims these stereotyped images to imbue them with power. African American identity was also a central theme in the work of the short-lived Jean-Michel Basquiat, a neo-expressionist painter who started out as a graffiti artist under the tag name of Samo. Basquiat struck up a close friendship with Andy Warhol, who helped promote his work, and the two shared a deep mutual respect and appreciation for each other's art and collaborated on multiple projects. Up until this time, most people did not see street art as having a place in the art world, but Basquiat played a large role in changing these perceptions with his expressionist-inspired work. Large, colorful, and full of both Western and African imagery, imbued with a deep spirituality as well. Some of his work was more straightforward, like this ode to famous Black jazz musicians, in particular Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker, and some was more abstract and conceptual, such as Red Kings, 2 heads adorned with Basquiat's signature crown motif. In tenor, Basquiat combines several different expressionist styles and techniques: bold gestural brushwork and bright colors, collaged backgrounds, and an abandonment of formal space, but with his own unique motifs and visuals. The skulking, shadowy forms of birds, rats, spiders, and monsters both reference the scuttling creatures of the urban New York City environment, while recalling a medieval tapestry of beasts with the patterned backgrounds. The disembodied floating heads and monstrous faces also reference both African masks, which played such a prominent role in Western art history, and Westerners' fears of African spirituality and magic, shrunken heads, and voodoo. Basquiat's work is the perfect model for postmodernism and the art that came after it. It is a seemingly bottomless blend of previous styles, visuals, cultures, all combined in a new and fresh style that is uniquely his. Other postmodern neo-expressionists, like Keith Haring, made art addressing sexual identity and orientation. Fueled by the emotion and urgency brought about by the AIDS crisis, individuals who had once stayed at the edges of society and the art establishment began to bring these issues to the forefront. Like Basquiat, Haring got his start in graffiti. He created simplistic, cartoonish street art portraits in the subways, which would be replaced sometimes multiple times a week with new illustrations once the old ones were removed. Haring's style was inspired by pop art, but unlike the original movement from the 60s, most of Haring's work centered around different social activism issues. As a gay man who would eventually die at age 31 from AIDS, activism surrounding the disease and the rights of LGBTQ+ individuals were frequent topics in his work. He was an incredibly prolific artist, producing hundreds of pieces in the short time that he was alive, and was dedicated to becoming a truly public artist. He valued simple lines and color, wanting to create simple illustrations that expressed clear messages of emotions, activism, and the joys of life. Other postmodern artists chose to venture farther into the controversial or taboo elements of art from this era, not necessarily linked to statements about race, gender, or sexual orientation. This began to incite public rage about funding for the arts. If it is offensive and ugly, people thought, should it be funded? One such controversy that is still debated today is Andres Serrano's Piss Christ. Serrano made several portraits involving the use of bodily fluids such as urine, blood, and semen. This particularly bright-colored photograph was taken by submerging a crucifix in the artist's urine. The portrait was met with disdain and disgust, viewers arguing that it should be removed because of its sacrilegious nature. Serrano, a devout Catholic, was insistent in his claim that it was not. The image was meant to be a comment on how the commercialization of images of Christ on t-shirts, bumper stickers, and cheap posters was disrespectful to his image and being, that by creating such cheap and tawdry reproductions and wearing them around, they were cheapening the meaning of the image, literally pissing on it, and taking value away from the image of Christ on the cross. British artist Chris O'Feely also drew on religious imagery with his portrait of the Virgin Mary, which was defaced in 1999 by an angered elderly viewer who called it sacrilegious. Set on a glittering orange resin background that recalls Byzantine portraits of religious figures, O'Feely has created a decidedly black Mary out of paint and elephant dung. Born to Nigerian parents, O'Feely took a trip to Africa that informed his art style as an adult. His use of elephant dung is both a reference to the Dada-started trend of using found objects, and also tying his work to the land, specifically to the African landscape. He forces the viewer to confront the possibility of a black Virgin Mary, completely removed from Western tradition, with both her appearance and the materials used. His work was evidently too controversial since it was destroyed, but begs the question of whether his work would have been defaced and removed if he was a white artist. The last genre of art we'll be looking at today is public art. Public art often consisted of large, permanent installations specifically made for public spaces and consumption. It was government-funded and raised lots of debate among the public about what art taxpayer money should or shouldn't fund and whether the public should have a say in it at all. Not all public art was totally controversial. Alexander Calder's massive flamingo sculpture is an example of well-received public art. With its simple, slightly abstracted, looping form constructed of steel, it is highly influenced by the constructivist movement in Russia. The whimsical statue is meant to be touched, and visitors can weave through its legs and take photos. The bright, red-painted steel evoking the silliness of an oversized lawn flamingo, while still looking graceful and complementing the surrounding buildings with its elegant arches. It is an excellent example of perhaps one of the most well-received public art pieces of all time. When it was unveiled, a parade was held for the artist. Far less well-received was Richard Serra's Tilted Arc, which has since been removed from the Federal Plaza where it once stood. A curved and slightly angled steel wall, meant to draw reference to both minimalism and earlier modernist movements, the sculpture quickly drew ire from people who worked in the surrounding buildings, because it forced people to detour as they crossed the plaza and made it impossible to hold concerts or performances. Over time, the steel weathered to a rusty brown and became covered with pigeon droppings and graffiti. Eventually, the sculpture was moved without Serra's permission, this time inciting rage from artists. This started a long-lasting debate between the public and artists over issues of funding for art and whether the public controlling public art was a form of censorship. The public also reacted negatively to Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Meant to commemorate those who had lost their lives in the war, Lin wanted to create a more subtle monument that spoke to the horrific loss of life on both sides of what many considered a pointless war of U.S. interventionism, rather than the ostentatious marble statues that were common for these types of memorials. Many considered Lynn's memorial underwhelming and not paying enough respect to the vets. A new memorial was built nearby, a group of marble statues in the more traditional style. Lynn and other artists argued that the creation of a new sculpture cheapened and devalued the seriousness and gravity of the memorial she'd created. Here are some key takeaways from our last lecture today. For postmodernists, both feminist and otherwise, they rejected the universal human experience that modernism sought to convey. They argued that art is not something universal, but rather very subjective, different to each individual, often based on the lived experiences of that individual from different cultures and works of art. They believed that this, identity and culture, should be central to art. We also see the beginnings of appropriation of images, intentional recycling or recognizable pictures. Art becomes even more self-referential, to the point where you need to have a decent knowledge of art history to understand it. We encounter issues of censorship, both with public art and arguments over funding, and with artists pushing the boundaries of what is acceptable and keeping the viewer comfortable. And finally, all of the art at this time, and increasingly into the future, is reflective of the cultural climate of both social activism and the growing internet and technological age that begins in the late 70s and accelerates rapidly in the 90s.